Wyoming Territory. Early October 1879. The wind cut through the open prairie like a blade, and the sun was setting fast behind the mountains when Lawson Zane spotted the shape lying still in the dirt. He pulled his horse up short, boots crunching as he slid down from the saddle. The figure was barely more than a shadow in the dying light, curled against a rock, arms wrapped around herself, dress torn and shoes gone. She did not move when he stepped closer. "Ma'am." His voice was low and even, but it carried. She flinched, a dry sound catching in her throat. Lawson crouched beside her. Her face was streaked with dust and dried tears, lips cracked from thirst, hair tangled and matted to her cheeks. But her eyes, the moment they opened, were sharp and wary under the dirt. She looked young, maybe 20 or 21 at most. The kind of young that had already seen too much. "You alone out here?" he asked. She did not answer. Her jaw tightened. Lawson looked at her fingers, raw and scraped. Her feet were swollen and bare. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Clara," she said hoarsely. "Clara Keene." He nodded, taking off his coat. "I am Lawson Zane. You do not look like you belong out here, Clara." "I do not belong anywhere," she whispered. Lawson did not ask more. He slipped his coat around her shoulders, careful and slow. Then, without another word, he leaned down, arms sliding under her knees and behind her back. She jerked weakly. "What are you? You do not ever sleep cold again," he said quietly, lifting her into his arms. That was the first thing he ever said to her that made her cry. Lawson's cabin sat in a hollow between two ridges, tucked against a line of pine and cottonwood. He laid her down in his bed, wrapped in wool blankets, and stoked the fire until the warmth filled the room. He did not ask questions that night. He brought her water, then broth, and later a bowl of stew. She ate in small, shaking bites, sitting on the edge of his bed with her eyes darting toward the door now, and then like a rabbit waiting for the trap to spring. Lawson sat across the room, whittling a piece of pine, his rifle within reach but untouched. He let the silence sit between them like something sacred. She fell asleep with the bowl still in her lap. By the third morning, Clara had stopped flinching every time he walked into the room. Lawson came in with a bucket of water from the creek, and she sat near the fire, wrapped in his old flannel shirt and one of his extra pairs of trousers rolled up at the ankles. "You got folks out there worried about you?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No one left." He waited. She looked down at her hands, fingers curled tight. "I was with a wagon train out of Kansas City," she said after a while. "Headed west with my husband." Lawson's chest tightened. "Where is he now?" "He died," she said simply. 3 weeks ago, snake bite, no one waited." "They left me behind." Lawson stared into the fire, his jaw clenched. "They left you?" "I was not strong enough to keep up," she said. "I had a fever. They thought I would die anyway." He said nothing, just took a long breath, then stood and stirred the coals. "I walked for 2 days," Clara said. "Then I stopped walking." She looked over at him. "Then you found me." Lawson met her eyes. "You are not alone anymore." She looked away fast, blinking hard. Days passed. The weather turned colder. Clara's color came back slowly, and she started helping where she could, sweeping the floor, chopping onions for stew, patching a hole in one of his shirts. Lawson never pushed. He saw how she retreated when things got too quiet, how she still jumped at distant gunshots or the crack of firewood splitting under the axe. But she laughed once, just once, when he slipped on the porch steps carrying firewood and cursed like the devil himself. That laugh stayed with him the rest of the day. One night, after a supper of fried potatoes and beans, they sat by the fire, both of them quiet. The wind outside howled like wolves were singing in the trees. "I think I forgot what it felt like," Clara said softly. He looked up. "What?" "To not be afraid." Lawson set his tin cup down. You do not have to be afraid here." She looked at him, eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this for me?" Lawson leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because you were sleeping in the dirt and no one should have to do that. And because when I looked at you, something in me said, do not let her go." Her breath caught. She looked down at her lap. "I lost someone too," he said. 5 years ago, my sister. She died in childbirth." Clara's eyes lifted. "I am sorry. She was all the family I had left. After that, I just stopped letting people close." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "Until me." He nodded. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. She reached over and laid her hand over his. Her touch was light, but it made his chest ache in the best kind of way. By the first snowfall, Clara had made the cabin feel different. There was a jar of dried wildflowers on the table. She had sewn curtains from old feed sacks. She was humming sometimes when she cooked. Lawson found himself watching her more. Not just the way she moved, but the way she smiled now without realizing it. The way she looked out the window when the snow fell, like she was seeing something good for the first time in years. One morning she stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee, wrapped in his coat, watching the snow drift down. He stepped behind her, his hand brushing her back. "You warm enough," she leaned into his side. "I am now." He turned her gently, tipping her chin up with one finger. Her lips parted, her breath warm. "I keep thinking," she said, "that I should be afraid to love again." He nodded. "Me too," she smiled. "But I am not." He kissed her then, slow and sure, snow falling soft around them, and just like that, like the spark catching fire, they both knew. They were not lost anymore. The snow deepened through November, blanketing the valley in silence. Clara woke each morning before first light, slipping from the warmth of Lawson's arms to stir the hearth and start the coffee. She moved easily now, her steps steady, her hands sure. The bruises, the cracked skin, the tremble in her voice, those had faded. What stayed was the quiet watchfulness she carried like a second skin, and Lawson never tried to strip it from her. He'd taken to carving a cradle in the evenings, shaping pine with slow, careful strokes. She didn't ask after it, not at first. But she'd begun sewing something with soft wool scraps she found in the trunk beneath the bed's small shirts, no bigger than her palm. One afternoon, after the snow had stopped and the sky turned glass clear, Lawson was oiling his saddle on the porch when Clara stepped outside in her boots, a scarf tucked under her chin. She squinted at the sun and said, "I want to ride out with you next time you go into town." He looked up. "It's a hard trail and colder than it looks. I'm not asking to be spared the cold." He nodded slowly, testing the girth strap. "You'll ride my old mare. She's steady. I'm not afraid of horses. I didn't figure you were." She stepped down off the porch and moved toward him. "I want to see what's out there. I've been in this valley for nearly 2 months, and I've only seen the inside of this cabin and the stretch of woods behind it." Lawson wiped his hands on a cloth. "Town's small. General store, blacksmith, post. There's a man sells coffee beans for too much money and a widow who likes to remind me I'm not married." Clara gave a small smile. "She'll be disappointed then." He held her gaze. "She already is." That night she pressed close to him in bed, her breath warm against his throat. "I don't know how to be someone's wife anymore," she whispered. "You don't have to be anything but yourself," he said. She folded her fingers through his. "You're making a cradle." He didn't answer right away. "Thought maybe someday, when you're ready." She turned her face toward his chest. "I think I might already be." The next morning they saddled 2 horses and rode out with the sun low behind them. The trail cut through snowdrifts and bare pines, the air sharp and clean. Clara's cheeks turned red from the wind, but she didn't complain. She rode like she'd done it her whole life, her posture upright, rein steady, eyes taking in every ridge and bend. They reached town just past midday. A few wagons stood near the livery and smoke curled up from chimneys. Children ran past them, chasing a hoop down the packed street. Lawson dismounted and tied off the reins, then turned to help Clara down. She didn't take his hand. "I can manage," she said, swinging her leg over and landing with a grunt. He let out a low breath, amused. "Didn't say you couldn't." She glanced around the street. "Which one's the general store?" He tipped his head. "There." She walked ahead of him, her scarf trailing in the wind. He followed, watching the way she moved, quiet but sure, like someone learning to trust her footing again. Inside, the store smelled of leather and molasses. Clara picked through bolts of fabric, running her fingers over calico and flannel. Lawson bartered for coffee and a new lantern wick. When he turned, he saw her standing near a shelf of ribbon, holding a spool of pale blue. "You want that?" he asked. She hesitated. "I'm not sure what for. Doesn't need a reason." She set it down. "Not yet." They rode back with the sky turning violet. Partway up the trail, Clara slowed her horse. "My mother used to sew ribbons into my hair on Sundays," she said. "Before we left Missouri." Lawson didn't speak. He let her memory hang in the pine-scented air between them. "She died in the cholera spring. My father after that. I don't talk about them much." "You don't have to. I want to." He turned his head toward her, waiting. She had a voice like honey warmed up. Used to sing while she shelled peas. "My father worked leather. His hands were always stained." Lawson nodded. "They sound like good people." They were. When they reached the cabin, Clara brushed down both horses before going inside. She moved slower now, thoughtful, her eyes a little distant. That evening, as Lawson lit the lamp, Clara opened the old sewing chest and took out the blue ribbon. "I think I'll use it after all," she said. "For your hair." She shook her head. "For the cradle." Lawson watched her for a long time, his hands still. "You're sure?" She met his eyes. "I am." He crossed the room and pulled her close, resting his chin against her temple. She whispered, "You said I wouldn't sleep cold again." "You haven't." "No," she said, curling her fingers into his shirt. "I haven't." Outside, snow fell soft again, covering the trail behind them. Inside, the fire burned steady, and every corner of the cabin held the warmth of something beginning. By late December, the wind moved with a different kind of bite. The snow no longer drifted light, it fell in thick curtains that buried fence posts and filled the hollows of the land. But inside the cabin, warmth held steady, pressed in by layers of cedar smoke and thick wool curtains Clara had sewn from an old quilt top she found in the loft. Lawson came in from the barn one evening, the hem of his coat stiff with ice. He stamped off the snow and hung his hat, watching her across the room. She stood beside the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, pressing dough into a tin pan. Her hair was pinned up, wisps curling against her neck from the heat. "You ever bake peach cobbler before?" she asked, without looking up. He leaned against the door frame. "Never had a reason to." Her mouth curved, but she didn't answer. She poured the filling carefully over the crust and folded the top layer of dough in place. He watched the way her hands moved, sure, unhurried, like she was building something meant to last. He stepped closer, brushing his fingers against her lower back. "You've made this place feel like more than just walls." She wiped her hands on a cloth. "You gave me the chance." "No," he said. "You took it." The cobbler baked while they ate the last of the venison stew. When the crust turned golden and the syrup bubbled up around the edges, she pulled it from the stove and set it on the windowsill to cool. Later, with the fire low and the lamp trimmed, she rested with her head against his chest, legs tucked beneath a blanket on the settee. The scent of cinnamon still lingered in the room. He traced small circles along her forearm. "You had dreams once, before all this, before Kansas City." She shifted slightly. "I wanted to teach. Not at some Eastern academy, just a schoolhouse near enough to walk to." I used to play school with my cousins, line up chairs and read from the Bible like it was a reader. You still could, he said. The settlement near the Big Ben's building one come spring. I heard it in town. She pulled back enough to see his face. You think they'd want someone like me? They'd want someone who's lived through enough to be patient with a child who can't sit still. She rested her hand against his jaw. You think kind things when you look at me. I only say what's true. All that night the wind rattled the eaves, but it didn't reach them. She woke once to the sound of it and found his arm still tight across her waist, his breath warm at her shoulder. After New Year's, they began preparing a space in the lean-to for 2 goats Lawson bartered for from a rancher east of the ridge. Clara spread hay and helped mend the gate while he replaced the rusted hinges. She wore a wool scarf tied snug and thick mittens he'd found in a trunk of his mother's things. As she worked, she paused and leaned on the pitchfork. When you were a boy, did you ever think you'd end up here? He looked up from the hinge. Didn't think I'd end up anywhere. Just kept moving west until the land stopped pushing back. She nodded. I think I stopped asking for more after I lost him, but it's coming back now. The wanting. He tightened the last screw and stood. Wanting what? Days that feel full. A roof that keeps out the wind. A man I trust not just with my life but with the small parts too. The quiet ones. He stepped closer, brushing a curl of hair back under her scarf. Then we keep building it. The goats arrived in a crate lashed to the back of a wagon. Clara named them Mercy and Junibug. She laughed when Junibug headbutted the feed bucket out of Lawson's hands. He pretended to grumble but built them a feeding trough that same afternoon. They started marking the days on the wall near the door. Not for any particular reason, just a habit that grew out of the steady rhythm of shared life. Clara would scratch a mark each morning after breakfast. Some days had notes beside them. First egg, storm broke fence. Lawson saw a bobcat. One morning, near the end of February, she drew a small circle instead of a line. He noticed it after she stepped outside to sweep the porch. "What's the circle for?" he asked as she came back in, cheeks flushed from the cold. She held her hands in front of her, fingers tucked under her palms. "I'm late, nearly 3 weeks now." He stood still, one hand resting on the back of the chair. "I wasn't sure at first. Thought maybe it was just the cold or the change of food, but I know my body. I've known it through worse." He crossed the room and took her hands. "How do you feel?" "Not sick, just tired." "And?" "Sure." She looked up at him, and there was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet steadiness that made his throat tighten. He bent down and kissed her knuckles. "Then we get ready." That night they moved the cradle into the main room. She laid the blue ribbon across its rim and began stitching a small quilt from leftover flannel. He added a second shelf above the cookstove for jars and bottles she might need. Neither of them said much, but everything they did was a word spoken in the language they'd built between them. Outside, the snow began to melt into the cracks of the earth. Inside, they waited not with worry, but with the kind of hope that had been earned. By the time the thaw reached the high ridges, the cabin stood on solid mud instead of frozen earth, and Clara had taken to walking the edge of the meadow each morning, hands resting low on her stomach, boots sinking in just enough to leave a trail behind. She moved slowly now, not from pain, but a measured caution, like someone who understood the cost of rushing things meant to grow. Lawson watched her from the barn one morning, the way she paused near the cottonwood grove and tilted her head, listening to the creek as it pushed through the last of the ice. He didn't call out, just waited until she turned on her own and came back to the porch, cheeks pink from wind. "There's wild mint coming up near the bend," she said, brushing mud from her hem. "I thought it might be too early, but it's there." He handed her a tin mug still warm from the stove. You want to dry some for the baby? I was thinking for tea. But yes. She sat on the steps, cradling the mug in both hands. I used to think spring was the loneliest season, everything waking up except the things you lost. Lawson eased down beside her, elbows resting on his knees. Still feel that way? No. She looked out toward the trees. Now it feels like a second chance. A few days later, he rode south to help a neighbor dig a new well. When he returned near dusk, the smell of yeast and smoke hung in the cabin like a promise. Clara had baked bread 2 loaves, round and dark crusted, and was sitting on the floor beside the cradle, humming something low as she stitched a small cap from muslin. He unlaced his boots and set them by the door. That smell's going to make me forget my name. She didn't turn. I wanted to surprise you. You did. He knelt beside her, careful not to disturb the thread stretched between her fingers. You've got a way of making things whole. She lowered the cap into her lap. I don't feel whole, not always. Me neither. She looked at him then. I think maybe that's what makes it work. They ate by lamplight, the bread still warm, thick with butter. Clara leaned back in her chair afterward, one hand braced against the table. Her fingers twitched a little. You all right? Lawson asked quietly. She nodded, but her eyes were distant. Just a stretch. He's strong tonight. He reached across and took her hand. She smiled faintly. I don't know, just feels that way. The next morning she stayed in bed longer than usual. Lawson brought her tea and sat beside her, their shoulders touching. I've been thinking, she said, watching the steam curl from the cup. About names. He waited. There was a teacher in our town back in Missouri. He could draw maps from memory, all the rivers, mountain ranges, everything. Taught me how to read topography before I was 10. What was his name? Elias. Lawson repeated it under his breath. That'd suit a boy. He looked at her. And if it's a girl, Clara's gaze didn't waver. I'd like to name her after your sister. He swallowed. You'd do that. She gave you the kind of heart that stopped for me on the prairie. I think she'd want to be remembered. The room was still a long while. Then he leaned forward and kissed her hairline. Then it'll be Elias or Ruth. Either way, they'll know where they came from. In early April, a parcel arrived by wagon. Lawson's order from the winter finally come through. Clara opened it carefully, peeling back the paper to find a small tin basin, a bar of lye soap wrapped in cloth, and a pair of newborn booties so soft they collapsed in her palm. She held them up, voice catching. They're smaller than I imagined. He came behind her, resting his chin on her shoulder. They won't be small for long. That night, she asked him to read aloud from the old book of Psalms tucked in the drawer beside the bed. She lay with her back pressed to his chest, her breathing slow as he read in a voice low and sure. When he finished, she whispered, I didn't think I'd ever feel safe enough to want something again. You don't have to want alone. She turned toward him, her eyes steady. I love you, Lawson Zane. He didn't answer with words, just pulled her close and let the silence say what it needed. Outside, the stars pushed through the clouds one by one until the whole sky seemed to hold its breath. Inside, they lay wrapped in each other, the weight of the past no longer a burden but a stone laid down gently, so something new could rise in its place. The creek had risen with the spring melt. It ran fast now, rolling over stones and fallen branches, carving new lines into the banks. Clara sat on the bench Lawson built beside it, her back straight, hands resting on her lap, watching the current with a stillness that had nothing to do with waiting and everything to do with knowing. She was due any day. Her belly curved beneath the folds of her dress, the fabric stretched tight and warm from the sun. The days had grown longer, and the breeze carried the scent of thawed earth and pine needles. She listened to the water, and to the thud of Lawson's axe further up the slope, rhythmic and steady. When he came down the path toward her, carrying 2 split logs under one arm, she turned her head slightly. "You've been out here a while," he said, setting the wood in the stack beside the porch. She nodded, brushing a curl from her cheek. "I wanted to listen to the creek. It's louder this year." He glanced toward the water. "Winter was long, it's got more to say." She took his hand as he lowered himself beside her. "Do you think we'll stay here always?" He didn't answer right away. "If you want to, I do, but I think I needed to ask. Just to be sure it's a choice, not something we fell into." He looked down at her fingers curled around his. "I chose you the first moment I saw you. Nothing since has been chance." That night the first pains came. She didn't cry out, only touched his shoulder as he slept beside her and said his name once. He was up immediately, lighting the lamp, steadying her as she stood with one hand on the table, breathing through the tightness. The midwife came before dawn, a woman named Hazel who rode in from east of the ridge, shoulders squared under a patched shawl and hands scrubbed clean. Lawson made up the cot near the fire, then stepped out to the porch, boots crunching on the still frozen ground. He waded through the long morning, pacing between the barn and the house, feeding the goats with shaking hands, whispering to them like they could carry the weight of his worry. Inside, Clara labored in silence, sweat on her brow, her fingers clenched around Hazel's as she pushed through each wave of pain. When the cry came, sharp and sudden, Lawson stumbled through the door just as Hazel wrapped the child in a clean cloth and laid him on Clara's chest. He stood in the doorway, stunned. Clara looked up at him, her face damp, eyes bright. "Come meet your son." He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her. The child's fists were small and pink, his mouth opening and closing like he was tasting the air. Lawson touched the top of his head with a reverence he didn't know he carried. "He's strong," Hazel said, wiping her hands. Clara cradled the baby close. "His name is Elias." Lawson closed his eyes for a moment, his hand resting over both of theirs. "He's perfect." Hazel cleaned the basin and packed her bag, nodding once to Lawson on her way out. "You've got a good woman there, and a healthy babe. Don't waste either." The door shut softly behind her. Lawson pulled the rocking chair close and sat beside the bed, watching Clara's breathing ease as the baby nursed. "You look like you've done this before," he said quietly. She smiled, exhausted but sure. "I haven't, but I know how to hold on." He reached for her hand. "So do I." They spent the next weeks in a kind of quiet that felt sacred. Clara healed slowly, walking again with cautious steps, her arms wrapped around Elias each time she moved from one end of the cabin to the other. She sang to him under her breath, old hymns remembered from Missouri, and sometimes just nonsense sounds that made him blink and coo. Lawson built a new fence section by section, pausing only to come inside and check on them, always with his thumb brushing the baby's cheek, his lips pressed gently to Clara's temple. One afternoon, as Clara rocked Elias near the window, she looked out at the budding branches. "I want to write again," she said, voice soft. Lawson glanced up from the table where he was mending a leather strap. "You wrote," she nodded, "before Kansas City. I'd send essays to a small paper in St. Louis. My name never made it in print, but the words did. What do you want to write now? Letters, stories, maybe something for the schoolhouse when it's built." He set the mending aside and came to her. "Then we'll find you good paper and ink. And if you want your name in print now, it'll be there. I don't need that anymore. I just want to leave something behind that says I lived." He kneeled beside her, resting his head lightly against her and Elias. "You've already done that. The last frost broke in late April. Birds returned to the trees, building nests in the eaves and singing from the fence posts. Clara planted a small patch of herbs behind the cabin, kneeling in the soft soil with Elias swaddled in a sling across her chest. Lawson carved a swing to hang from the cottonwood near the creek, smoothing the wood by hand and tying the ropes with knots that would hold through any season. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the breeze carried the scent of young grass, Clara stood barefoot on the porch, Elias nestled in her arms. Lawson came up behind her, wrapping his arms around them both. "He'll never know hunger," Clara said, "or fear," Lawson added. "Or loneliness." "No," Lawson said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Not while we breathe." She turned in his arms, their son between them, and for a long moment they stood there, the three of them, held together not by chance or necessity, but by something they'd built with each quiet hour, each steady step forward. Clara leaned against him, and he rested his chin on her crown, eyes on the land as it greened before them. They had come from loss, from silence, from the kind of sorrow that doesn't always name itself out loud. And still, they had found this: a cabin warmed by fire, a cradle that rocked gently in the night, a river that kept moving forward no matter what had come before, a life that would last, forever if they were careful. And they would be.